I'd like to start with one big, broad question. What is happiness?
If you go way back 2,400 years, Aristotle was one of the great philosophers of the Western tradition. And he wrote a book on happiness. It's not equal to pleasure. Aristotle differentiated between happiness and pleasure. He said it's not pleasure.
Gary Arnell is a philosopher who has studied how best to live for individual and societal flourishing and happiness.
Aristotle taught that happiness, or the complete life, has 4 parts.
Gary Arnell, welcome to the show.
Hey, Nicholas, thank you for having me.
I'd like to start with one big, broad question. What is happiness?
What is happiness? Oh, gosh, that is a really big question. And first of all, thank you for having me on your show. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for joining me.
Happiness is, if you go way back 2,400 years, Aristotle was one of the great philosophers of the Western tradition. And he wrote a book on happiness. He said that happiness is the thing that every human seeks for in their life, that everything we do is to achieve happiness. And if you look at something you're doing right now, you can ask yourself, why? Why am I doing that? And if you keep asking why, and you keep digging down, the eventual reason is, I want happiness. This thing that I'm doing will bring me happiness. And so it is the pinnacle of human, it's the end goal of everything that we do, according to Aristotle. And I think if you go around and ask people on the street today, you'll still get that same answer. If you say, what do you want? And they'll say, well, I want a degree, or I want a relationship, or I want to travel, or I want to whatever it is that they say they want to do. You start asking them why, you will eventually get to, because that makes me happy. So happiness is the pinnacle of human existence. That is what we're seeking. Thomas Jefferson, or at least the committee that put together the Declaration of Independence, they listed the pursuit of happiness as one of rights, one of our human rights, along with life and liberty. And they said that was that's inherent in our being and what we're seeking for, and our form of government should help us pursue that. So that's very interesting. It's like if is happiness so consistent across human nature and across people that we can all the government can have some kind of role in that. What role would that be? Why would they include that in the Declaration of Independence? Very, very interesting that would be in there. But it ties right back to Aristotle and what he said about happiness. So that's I guess, to answer your question, that would be it. It is the thing we are all seeking after. If you dig down deep enough, everything we're doing is in that pursuit of that happiness.
Yeah, I could see how I'd say human universal, because people often will highlight subjective aspects of the human experience when in fact we're all the same species. So we all do seek fundamentally the same things. So happiness is this it's like the end to our means. We seek all these things as means goals, but the end goal itself is happiness, right?
Right.
So more in a less abstract way, in a more concrete way, what specifically is that we seek? We do all these things for happiness, but what specifically is that we're doing these things for? Is it a feeling?
Great question. I don't think it's a sensation so much as a state of being, and I don't know that it's not equal to pleasure. Aristotle differentiated between happiness and pleasure. He said it's not pleasure. He said it's the life of the gods, is what he said. He said the gods are happy. And to be happy is to live the life of the gods. And so it's a state of being, and pursuing it, that path can be difficult. It can be full of challenges and setbacks. And so it's not pleasure. It's not the absence of trial. It's not the absence of setbacks or difficulties. It is a state of, I think you might say, satisfaction. And Aristotle had a specific definition that I think is applicable even to this day. I don't think it's been refuted. I think it's very applicable to the kind of society that we have inherited. But I guess I would say that it's a state of being, of satisfaction, of wholeness, of completeness, of I'm doing. Well, I mean, again, bringing the Greeks back into the conversation. The word virtue originally from the Greeks meant that which performs the function defined by its creator. That's what virtue means. So if a Delphian knife was virtuous, it meant that it was sharp enough to perform the sacrifice that it was created to perform. So that's a virtuous knife. If it's unvirtuous, it means the knife is dull. It doesn't do its job. So virtue is to fulfill the measure of your creation, whatever the creator of whatever thing you're talking about. If the thing is fulfilling that, it's virtuous. That's what virtue is. And so I think that, and Aristotle tied happiness to virtue, direct tie. So I guess you could say if happiness is the life of the gods, and a key element of that happiness is to be virtuous, and that's what he said, then it is to fulfill the measure of our creator, whoever that is, whether it's the universe or however you want to call that. And that's a whole long conversation by itself, right?
Oh, man, that conversation would take up this entire interview.
Yeah. Is there a creator or creators? Who are they? She, he, they, it, whatever. And what purpose, if any, is there? Or are we all just meat sacks floating through space who have no purpose? That these are deep, fundamental questions that we don't really get into in your K-12 experience, and very often not even in your undergraduate experience. And that's part of what when I say it's missing, that's what I'm talking about. Is it's almost as though there is an assumed okay, you're going to get that somewhere else. We're not going to teach you that here. But these questions can be discussed in and maybe it's because there's a fear of crossing over state and, religion and state boundaries or something like that. But these are fundamental questions that we have to have conversations about, because it deeply defines who we are, what trajectory we need to have in life. And you can do that without imposing a religious tradition on people, I think.
It's a difficult balance to strike, because on the one hand, it seems a bit atrocious to me that our education system simply leaves these big issues like what are we, where have we come from, just leaves them out of the whole system for the most part, and leaves it to parents, which, I mean, of course, there are a lot of problems with an education system imposing a certain worldview. But then again, it's difficult because what do your parents know? They might know, they might not know, might not know much of anything. So it's a difficult issue. And there's so much disagreement on this issue of where did we come from? What is our purpose? What is our meaning? How have you determined this for yourself?
Well, bridging from what you just said, I think that a proper education can present you with the various main theories without saying, I think you should pick this one. I think it can say, here are the main schools of thought that have been fought over and discussed and thought through over the centuries. And it's up to you to decide which one. Otherwise, you're left to experience life and all that goes with it, all of our hormones and aging and the interplay with other human beings, all of which has been explored and tries to be explained by these schools of thoughts, these traditions, and you're left it's almost like each of these traditions is an instruction manual. This is why you're here. This is how you should live. And they all say it may be have different answers to those questions. But if you don't have any instruction manual at all, and you're just experiencing life and the emotion and the rejection and the acceptance and lying and cheating and honesty and caring and love and all that goes into interacting with other people, how do you interpret that? How do you make sense of that? How should I act in relation to others? How do I know if someone has true motives or they're just trying to flatter me? You need to have some kind of blueprint to work from. And even if you're going to change that blueprint over time, great, but start with a blueprint. I think if we decide, we need to let children wait until they're an adult to decide these blueprint questions, it's almost like saying, I'm not going to teach my child to read until they're an adult, because I want them to choose for themselves to read. It's like, no. I'm going to teach my child to read, and I'm going to teach them blueprints. And then when they're an adult, they can choose the blueprint themselves. But we can't leave. I think we do a great disservice if we don't introduce the blueprints, at least here's the major schools of thought.
Yes, and teach the like the primary pros and cons, so to speak. So the strong aspects of each and the weaker aspects of each. And this idea of blueprints, actually, I have a question about Aristotle. You were talking about how happiness is essentially living, what was it, life as the gods or something like that?
That's how he defined it, that happiness is the life of the gods. And so we're seeking to live the life that they live, or live as they would, do as they do. Yeah, that's how he described it.
And then virtue being to fulfill in our lives the purpose for which we were created. And I assume Aristotle believed in the ancient Greek faith. So why should we listen to anything he says about regarding what the gods wanted if we very safely assume those gods not to exist?
Yeah. So great question. He said that virtue, one, and I don't know, I can't remember. I don't know that he said the whole idea of it being the doing that which your creator designed you for. But that comes from the Greeks. I can't remember if it was Aristotle who said it. But the way that Aristotle described virtue is to do the right thing at the right time, towards the right person, for the right length, for the right reason. That's virtue. An action is virtuous if it's the right thing to do towards the person that you're interfacing with, for the right length, the right reason, at the right moment. And so lesson one of living life is seek to live a virtuous life, which is in every moment, seek to do the right thing in that moment, whatever the right thing happens to be. Right thing, right person, right amount, right length, right reason, etc. And that's what virtue is. And to either side of that virtue is doing too little or doing too much. And so there's this idea called the golden mean that Aristotle talked about, where there's like this needle. If you have like a little dial, like a speedometer or whatever on your car dashboard, it can go like this, and you're trying to keep it straight of what is the very right thing to do. And if you go either side, it's a vice. So it wasn't virtue and vice. It was virtue and vice to both sides. And one example, he gave an example of many different virtues. One of them is courage, for example. And he said that courage, too little is cowardice, too much is bravado, or I'm forgetting the word off the top of my head, but it's like if you're going to charge the cannon and there is no chance, if you're leading men into battle and you're going to charge the cannon, there is no chance that you're going to make it. That would be too much. You're displaying bravery in a way that's going to get you killed with no benefit to your men or to your cause. And so that would actually move into vice territory. Whereas if there was a chance, and maybe the right thing to do is to go and charge the cannon, you're like, no, you're cowering in fear. That would be too little. And so that becomes a vice. So it's extremely difficult to know what is the right thing to do in the moment toward the right. And we're faced with these decisions constantly every single day in every interaction that we have with people. What is the right way to treat this person? What is the right action to take with my spouse, with my children, with my community, as a citizen, in my job? It's like we're confronted with what is the right thing to do? The Goldilocks question, like too much, too little, just right. That idea, that is the core idea to Aristotle's notion of happiness. And his first level is virtue. You got to have virtue. And so I can ascribe to that. I'm personally of a Christian tradition is what I follow. And I can ascribe to that definition. I'm like, that definition jives with the Judeo-Christian tradition that I hold. To do the right thing to the right person at the right time for the right length, the right reason. I believe that's what my God wants me to do. And it's what Aristotle thought his gods wanted him to do. And I could say, yep, Aristotle, I'm with you on that. It's part of the Stoic tradition. And the Stoic tradition had a lot of influence on Christianity. When Christianity came along 4 centuries later, the Christians were like, they thought Stoicism was very compatible with Christianity. And that continued to the founding of this country. You have the founders of the United States who were very much steeped in the Christian tradition, and they also brought in the Stoic tradition of the Greeks. So that would be my first answer to your question is virtue. You have to ask, well, what did he mean by virtue, and can you ascribe to that? Whereas opposed to, say, the Epicurean model, which is it's all about pleasure. Pleasure is what this life is all about. And I look at that and I say, no, I disagree. I disagree with the idea that pleasure is all, because if I project that out to the end, like if everyone is seeking their own pleasure, society falls apart very quickly. And so I'm like, okay, Epicureans, no. Stoicism through Aristotle, yes, I can ascribe to that one.
Yes, because your blueprint has to survive iteration across many people.
Yes. And I don't know if you're a fan of Jordan Peterson, but he's talked about that. He talks about the idea of playing games, and the first goal of the game is to be able to play the next game. And so if you play a game in such a way that it disallows you from playing the next game of life, if you interact with a person in such a way that they're like, I'm done with you, I cannot interact with you, then even if you won whatever you're trying to get out of that game, your series of games with that person is over. And he says, no, the point of life is to continue to play the games, which is really an iteration, in my opinion, of virtue. You're continuing to try to do the right thing, trying to do the right thing. And we constantly fail as human beings, but we're trying to do the right thing over and over again and iterating and trying to get better and better and playing those games over and over again and not getting to a point where we close ourselves out from the series of games.
Would you say that virtue serves to keep us in the games?
Yes.
Okay, so you've now stated two reasons to be virtuous. Firstly, virtue as a gateway to happiness, and second, virtue as a means to stay in social games. You also mentioned that Aristotle believed that to be virtuous, you had to be virtuous for the right reasons. What are those reasons? What is the reason, according to Aristotle, to be virtuous?
So Aristotle taught that happiness, or the complete life, has 4 parts. One is virtue, which everybody said is doing the right thing, right time, right person, right place, right length of time. The second one is to gain wisdom, which means gaining knowledge of that which does not change. So knowledge of the gods, in his words, knowledge of human nature, knowledge of the heavens, that which is consistent across human experience. Wisdom. So that was number 2. Number 1, virtue. Number 2, wisdom. Number 3 is judgment, which is the ability to discern and knowledge of, and the ability to judge between things that do change. So things change at work all the time. Things change with our children all the time, with our spouse, and we have to make judgment calls. And so it's the day-to-day interplay of, what is the right job choice to make right now? What is the right study path to go in school? What is the right way to treat my child at age 6 versus 7 versus 8 versus 18? All of those kinds of ideas. There are 2 different sets of knowledge. He says you have to have both. One of the eternal, the things that don't change, and the things that do change. And, some people, like I'm more of an intellectual type person. So I like to be in the wisdom category. But he says, no, you've got to also make sure you're learning in the judgment category, the practical, the everyday. And the fourth, so you have virtue, wisdom, judgment. And the fourth was property. He says you have to have property, which is a very interesting piece of the happiness puzzle. It's like, wait, why property? And he said, you have to have property because it allows you to be independent and not beholden to other people. So you can be independent in your virtuous actions. You can act virtually and withstand, like if people start to cut you off, or if you're doing the right thing means, losing your job, it can be very hard to do the right thing. So to gain property, so you can be independent and do the right thing, even when it's really hard. You can be generous or even magnanimous, which is just generosity at a high level. You can give. So he talked about generosity and magnanimity as 2 of the key virtues, that you have to give back to your community. You have to give to people. And that's one mark of a virtuous person, is that they're giving generously throughout their life. And so if to have property allows you to be independent, allows you to be generous, and it's also it's a stewardship. You learn property it requires that you be a steward. How do you properly use that property? How do you How do you tend it? How do you, the parable of the talents? It's all about property. How do you take what you've been given and multiply it? How do you increase it? How do you make it more beautiful, more good? How do you make it do more good in the world? So it's very much it's kind of, judgment again. It's part of judgment again. It's like, how do I keep and increase this property and use it to do good in the world and not lose it? Fool and his money are soon parted. That kind of an idea. It's like, you got to have judgment. And who are the people that we want to have property? Those who are virtuous, who have wisdom, and who have judgment. Those are the people we want. You have a billionaire who's a spendthrift and uses his money only for himself and he doesn't give to others. Like we yearn for those people to use their property for good. And that yearning is right out of Aristotle. We don't usually recognize it, but we're wanting them to live their complete life, which is to become steward and then give generously, magnanimously to their community. And if you have, and this is getting kind of into other parts of Aristotle, but he says, if you've spent your life trying to live virtuous, which builds builds character, virtue, practicing virtue over time creates a person of character, wisdom, and judgment. They're going to know how to use that property to solve the problems of their community. They're going to know where are the people that need to be fed, clothed, educated. Where are the people, to feed the hungry, to clothe the naked, to educate the ignorant, to liberate the captive, to house the homeless. They're going to know, they're going to be so involved with their community through their practicing of virtue, their attaining of wisdom and judgment, and their acquiring and stewardship of property, that they'll know how to, a targeted way to fix the problems of the society that they live in. So it wasn't just an individual. For him, happiness didn't just stop at the individual level. It very much then the next level is like, okay, now your circle of concern expands to your fellow man. And he talked about this, many people may have heard of Aristotle's discussion of friendship, where there's three types of friendship. He says there's friendships of pleasure, friendships of utility, and friendships of virtue. And you can sit back and reflect on your various friendships and say, what kind are they? Which ones are the ones that I go play poker with the boys on Friday night? That's a friendship of pleasure. I enjoy playing poker. We have a good time. We tell jokes. We smoke our cigars, whatever it is that we do. That's a friendship of pleasure, typically. A friendship of utility, like my friend has a boat. I have a plane. We get together. We use his boat. We use his plane. We like, whatever. That's just an example. But friendships of pleasure, we do things together because, or utility, there's a give and take relationship there. My friend knows he's very practical. He knows how to weld, and I need help with my house, and he comes and help, and then I go help him with his spreadsheets because I'm really good with computers. There's a kind of an exchange there of value. That's a friendship of utility. Friendship of, and they're all good. They're all, he's not downplaying any of them, but he says that friendships of virtue are the highest form of relationship. So relationships form a key part of this idea of happiness as well, having these friendships of virtue. And a friendship of virtue would be between two or more people who are pursuing that path of virtue, of character, wisdom, judgment, stewardship over property. And he says that those kinds of people, as their circle of concern expands, they seek justice, another virtue, justice for their fellow man. How do I improve the circumstances of my fellow man? That's what he saw as justice. How do I have virtue be occurring in the lives of others, not just me? What's going on in their environment that I could help with that would allow them to live this complete life as well? And he says these friendships of virtue, they form communities. That they're what form communities. They get together and they form and structure societies and communities, starting small but expanding. And I think that the U.S. founders is a really good example of friendships of virtue. They didn't agree on everything, but they had a core set of values, and they had developed themselves in such a way that, like, we want to have a particular kind of society. And this is where I think Aristotle could really help us today, in that Aristotle laid the foundation for the antidote to a problem that has plagued humankind forever, which is the problem of power, the problem of power dynamics, the problem of power hierarchies, where systems of government throughout history, the vast majority of them have been based on power struggles, on might makes right. And so in the days of the dynasties and the czar or the empires or the kingdoms, everyone would maneuver themselves to be in favor with the person at the top, whoever that was. And so your actions were not necessarily virtuous. They were what's going to get me in most favor with and favor from the person in power. So it was a power dynamic, not a virtue dynamic. And it's very difficult to get away. Extremely difficult to get away from this. I remember years ago, I had a cousin whose wife was pregnant with their first child. And the child was due like January 2nd or something like that. And he's like, I really hope that our child is born on December 31st so we get the tax write-off. That is forming your life, arranging your life and having your desires and goals around the tax code that's not necessarily a virtue dynamic. That's a power dynamic. What benefit am I going to get if I behave in this way, or if my wife behaves in this way? That's a power dynamic. And that's like the human default is to behave in that way. And Aristotle's formula of happiness, of virtue, wisdom, judgment, property, friendships of virtue, that whole model creates a space that says, you know what, we could have a society that's not based on power dynamics, but rather on truth, on virtue. Because what is truth? Truth is simply you have reality, which is how things actually are, which none of us have a correct perception of because it's too vast and too huge, and we have limited perception. But that's what reality is. Truth is a description of reality, of some little section of reality. The sky is blue today, that I can see. That doesn't say about other places in the world. It doesn't, over there, over the mountain where there's cloudy or whatever, but truth is a description of reality in some little subset of reality. And pursuing truth versus pursuing power is, the pursuit of truth is a pursuit of virtue because it's the right thing. It's the true thing. What is actually happening? And so, yeah, so I'm kind of getting away from your last question, but from Aristotle's notion of individual happiness, we start to see how we can create a society that's based not on power, not on who do I marry my daughter off to gain favor with that, with that baron or whatever, but how do I align myself? How do we create a society that's aligned with virtue and truth, which is what Western civilization and the United States of America in particular that's the ideal that it was founded on. And that's why you see in the Federalist Papers and in the Constitution, it was a limitation of power. It's like, we are going to minimize power. We're going to minimize it and we're going to separate it, because they knew the problems of power and they had studied it, deeply. And so they were like, we've got to get, which we no longer really honor. We very much want to hire as our top boss. We're in the middle of a presidential election right now. We want to hire someone who's going to solve the world's problems through the force of legislative, mandates. We want our president, for example, of our party to issue those, the mandates that are going to give us what we want, what we think is the right thing, instead of pursuing a virtuous path through it, through persuasion, through competition, through cooperation, through discussion. It's like, no, let's just force everyone to do. Let's pass a law that's going to make everyone do what I think is the way that the world should be. So that's a departure from the Aristotelian model of virtue. Everyone's pursuing virtue, and so you've got to be free. So liberty is a key component of the Aristotelian model, as well as the Christian model. That's why they're so compatible, because you've got to be free to act. If you act in a certain way out of coercion, is that really for the right reason? You lose it. It stops being virtuous, really, or it's less virtuous because you're doing it because someone's making you do it, not as a free act of your own will. And so liberty is a crucial component of Aristotle's plan of happiness, of how happiness works, because you've got to make that choice yourself. Otherwise, it's not virtuous. And so once you get off that virtue path, you're no longer, you're outside of his model. That was me talking a lot.
Well, I heard, especially at the end there, you said liberty was required to pursue virtue. You say happiness is built off of virtue. And of course, we need life to be free and to pursue virtue. And that sounds very familiar to me. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Was that their intention?
I believe it was. And I think you can see in a letter written, Henry Lee wrote a letter to Jefferson about 49 years, I think it was in 1824. And he asked Jefferson, 50 years ago, when you wrote the Declaration of Independence, where did you get those ideas? Where did that come from? Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. And he said, well, it was the zeitgeist of the time. It's what everyone was talking about. So you had a people who were all in agreement, general agreement of, we want a society that looks something like this. And he said, specifically, I got those ideas from Aristotle, Locke, Sidney, and Cicero, and others. But the first one he mentioned was Aristotle. And Aristotle, Jefferson was reading Greek like at age 9, I think, 6 or 9. And he was reading Greek by age 6 or 9. So he was reading Aristotle in the original Greek from an early age. And then Cicero has some fabulous echoes of Aristotle. One thing I've left out so far of the whole Aristotelian model is, well, how do you know what the right thing is to do? You're supposed to be virtuous. You're supposed to do the right thing at the right time towards the right person in the right amount for the right reason. Well, how do you know what that is?
And that was my next question.
Yeah. It's like, how do you know? And both Aristotle and Cicero had just brilliant insights into this. Aristotle said, there's a voice inside each of us that tells us what to do or what not to do if we listen closely. And he said that voice it's either divine or it's the most divine thing in us. I'm like, I don't know. I'm not sure which. It's either divine or it's the most divine thing within each of us. And it tells us how to live the life of the gods, how to live a virtuous life. And so you have to cultivate that voice. And he called that voice reason. That's what he called it reason. And some people might call that a conscience. And I think other different religious traditions will have different names for that. I think most people will recognize conscience because we're like, yeah, I do have a voice inside of me that tells me, like, don't do that thing. And he said, if you disobey that voice, by the way, the voice gets quieter and quieter and quieter and quiet over until we can't hear it anymore, at which time you become a beast. He says that man can be either the highest angel or the lowest beast, depending on the degree to which he listens to this voice inside of him. So reason is what he called it. And we see that even, 2.5 millennia later, we still see echoes of that idea in our legal language today. If you go look at in a court of law, the standard of behavior is often, what would a reasonable person do in this situation? What does that mean? It's what would a person who is hearing the divine voice within themselves do in that situation? And the assumption is all reasonable people would act in this one way in this situation. And that's the right virtuous way to act. Did the defendant act in that way? In the way that a reasonable person, a person hearing the divine voice, would have acted? Was the person acting in accordance with the divine voice? So when you hear in a court of law, a reasonable standard, a reasonable behavior, that's what it's hearkening back to. And Cicero said the same thing. Cicero said there is a law that is higher than human law. And if human law is incongruent with the higher law, that law, the human law, is invalid. That's how you know if a law is a good law or a bad law. Is it congruent with this higher law that he was talking about? And that's what gives you mentioned the Declaration of Independence. That's what when Jefferson said that when the ends of the government is meant to protect certain things, among which are life, liberty, pursuit of property. Oh, well, we'll get to the property versus happiness in a minute. Among which is life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And if it becomes antithetical to those ends, if government is no longer doing that, human beings have the right to throw off that government. They have a right to throw off that government. It's like, well, where does that right come from? Well, Aristotle, Cicero, Locke, which we can talk about in a minute, the idea that there is, if your system of government is incompatible with that higher law, with the law that dictates a reason, then you can replace it and say, I'm going to put in place a government that will conform to these ideas, to the idea of reason. And just to tie in that notion of property, most people are familiar with the idea that Jefferson originally wrote Life, Liberty, and Property. And so then why did it get changed to the pursuit of happiness? Well, property, as I mentioned earlier, is a component of happiness. And it's the only component of happiness that government really can do anything about. It can't force you to be wise. It can't force you to be virtuous, although some people want to try. It can't force you to have good judgment, but it can enforce property rights. And so he originally wrote Life, Liberty, and Property, but the committee, and some think it was Franklin that said, hey, we should change this. They eventually changed it to happiness. Happiness was the broader, complete idea. Property was just the piece that government could do something about, which takes us to Locke. John Locke, who is part of the Scottish Enlightenment, brilliant ideas that came out of that we still hold to today. We just don't realize that they come from him. Locke said that, this speaks to the life liberty part. So we already got into the liberty part a little bit with Aristotle. You've got to be free to be able to act virtuously. It's not a virtuous act if you're not acting freely. Locke said that it's this idea of imago Dei, which is Latin for the image of God. Locke said that he was wrestling with this, with the power question. He in the second treatise on government, he wrote the first treatise on government. He wrote the second treatise on government. In the first treatise on government, he was following up on what Sidney had said about how the divine right of kings is wrong. The divine right of kings is a wrong model. It's based on Christianity, and it was justified using the Christian Bible. But he says it, but Sidney first and then Locke said, here's why that's wrong. Here's where they went wrong on that. In the second treatise on government, Locke said, what is the proper role of government? Every society has to be governed, well, what is the proper role? And he says, well, man is in, so this is now, 2,000 years later, 2,000 plus years after Aristotle, but so you've got the whole Christian fathers, Aquinas, all these, Augustine, all these people who've come since then, which would be a fascinating conversation too. But he said, well, man is made in God's image. Here's where we start to see the Christian influence in the founding of the United States and even in Western society in general. He said, if man is created in God's image, so you got the creator, you got that creator, created, virtue dynamic coming into play. If man is created in God's image and belongs to God, we are God's property. He decides when we come and he decides when we go. That's what Locke said. He decides. We are his property. That means I can't decide when somebody else comes or goes. I'm not allowed to take someone else's life. I don't have a right to someone else's life, but I do have a right to my life. I have to defend the life that God gave me because only God can rightly take me out of life, can end my life because I belong to him. So every person has a right to life in themselves. Every person is sovereign. This idea of individual sovereignty, that's where it comes from. It comes from imago Dei, the image of God. So Locke is sitting there thinking, okay, so if everyone is secure in their life in a state of nature, meaning if two people meet in a dark alley and there's no policeman around, can one person just simply take the stuff from the other person and kill the weaker person? Or would that be wrong? Why would it be wrong? Because of imago Dei. You don't have a right to just go and willy-nilly take someone else's life because that's God's purview, not your own. Well, what about property? Well, property, Locke said, is the mixture of someone's life or time with the earth that God gave to man. That's what property is. So it's a combination of life and property. It's labor. So property is also, you can also defend your property. You can't take someone else's property because doing so would violate that principle of individual sovereignty. that comes from Imago Dei. So he's building on this idea, and he says, okay, so what if somebody comes and tries to take my life or my stuff, or the life or stuff of someone that I love, that is within my stewardship, my wife, my children? Well, I can defend myself. I have a right to self-defense. I don't have to just lie back. If someone comes and threatens me to take my life or my stuff, I don't have to just lie back and take it. I can use force against them to stop them from taking my life or my property. There is a right to life, liberty, property, and self-defense of life, liberty, and property. So he's building on these Christian notions that came out of Imago Dei. And he says, okay, well, if I have a right to self-defense, I can delegate that which I have a right to. That means I could hire. I don't want to spend my whole time, my hoe, my pitch, working the land, my plow in one hand and a sword in the other. That's very ineffective. Let's group together and let's hire somebody to patrol the borders of our community and be our sheriff. And we delegate the right to self-defense to that person. Because I have a right myself to do that, I can delegate the right to someone else. And that's where that is the very foundational form, essence of government, is delegating the power of defense to another entity. And that came out of Locke. So we get life, liberty, property, self-defense comes out of Locke, and which comes out of the Christian tradition, and is compatible with the Aristotelian, Stoic, Greek tradition of happiness, virtue, wisdom, judgment, property, stewardship, etc. So that was one major contribution of Locke. Another major contribution of Locke was the idea of tolerance. He said Christianity requires persuasion. You cannot coerce. You cannot force anyone to heaven, was basically the idea. And so if you want someone to act in a certain way, you have to persuade them. You can't compel them. You can't coerce them. So we have to get really good at speech. We have to get really good at conversation. We have to get really good at persuasion. That's why freedom of speech is so important, because it's either the pen or the sword. If we're going to live together as a people, which dynamic is going to hold out? Is it going to be the power dynamic? We talked about that, Aristotle introduced an antidote to, where people just fight by, make decisions by sword, or are we going to make decisions by the pen, by the voice? So you have to have a freedom of speech. You have to be able to discuss and even rigorously discuss your ideas. You have to have a freedom of association where you can meet with people to discuss. And so you have tyrannical regimes who will take away the freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of association. You can't gather in more than groups of 3. Those kinds of rules would be put in place in other regimes elsewhere throughout history to prevent this very thing of, if it's not going to be by power and force and coercion and the sword and the gun, it's got to be through persuasion. It's got to be through discussion. It's got to be through competition of ideas and etc. It can't be through compulsion. So it's either discussion or compulsion. It always comes back to this: virtue must be done through liberty or compulsion. So liberty versus compulsion is this. But we saw both in Aristotle, we see it in Locke as well. And so that's where the idea of tolerance comes from in our modern society. In fact, you can go read John Locke's Letter Concerning Toleration. That's where our modern idea of tolerance. You have to tolerate people's of other ideas, of other belief systems, which we still hold today, although we battle, hard in the world of ideas. That's where it comes from. That you have to let people speak their piece. It comes from John Locke, from the Letter Concerning Toleration, which comes out of Christianity. And so this Western tradition that we have inherited, where we've talked about just a few components of it, the reasoning behind why is freedom of speech important? Why is freedom of association important? What is the life, liberty, property, pursuit of happiness? What are those things? They didn't just come out of nowhere. There's a whole philosophical tradition that, if you understand it, you can help defend against inroads against it. So yeah, so we've covered Locke's contribution of tolerance, Locke's contribution of imago Dei, life, liberty, self-defense, which is very much present in our day. If like I said before, we're watching a presidential election in the United States right now, and you can see these ideas battling out on your television in front of you if you recognize them from Locke, Aristotle, Cicero, etc. For example, Locke said, as I mentioned earlier, that the only thing I can delegate is that which I have a right to myself to do. For example, self-defense. So if I can defend myself, I can delegate that right to a sheriff or to a sheriff's office or to a county sheriff, the deputies. You can create a whole hierarchy of people and court systems, lawyers, etc., whose job it is to defend the right to life, liberty, and property when there's infringements upon those things. So you can see the state already starting to form around this one idea of imago Dei and the right to self-defense. Well, then the question is, well, what about other good things? Defending my life is not the only good thing that there is to do. I also need to feed my family. I need to clothe my family. I need to house my family. I need to heal my family when they're sick. Those are all good things that I want to accomplish with my life, that I want to spend my time doing, right?
Why are they good things?
Why are they good things? Great question. So why is housing a good thing? Why is clothing a good thing? Why is food a good thing? Why is healthcare a good thing? Why is education a good thing? I think that most of them sustain life to begin with. If you don't have shelter, if you don't have clothing, if you don't have food, life itself will end. And so they're a means to the end of life, which, according to Locke and others in the Christian tradition on which this country was founded, we are meant, God has given us life and then has told us to go do things with it. So you need those things, and an education helps you understand, what am I to do with life and how do I do it? So all those things are good things. So, and will help me to fulfill the measure of my creation. Go back to Aristotle, because I think you can see that coming from both Christianity, the Judeo-Christian tradition, and the Aristotelian tradition. Then the question is, well, can I force people to make those things happen in my life? Can I force someone to educate me? Can I force someone to clothe me? Can I force someone to house me? Can I force someone? It's like, no, that doesn't come out of imago Dei. Imago Dei says, God gives me a right to life. No one can take my life. He gives me a right to property. No one can take my property. But I am to work for my food. I am to work for my clothing. I'm to work for my housing. I'm to work for my education. I can't go take that from someone. To do that would take from their property. Now, within certain traditions like Christianity, there is a Christian duty to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, house the homeless, educate the ignorant, liberate the captive, heal the sick. There is a Christian duty to do those things, but is it virtuous if you're forced to do it? No. Going back to Aristotle. So you have to do those things freely of your own will, or it's not virtuous, and it would be a violation of your own liberty and your life, your labor. So under this Lockean model of life, liberty, property, we can delegate to a government system to defend our life, liberty, and property, but it can't be used to take stuff from people to provide social goods. The social goods, according to Aristotle and Christianity, must be done by ourselves voluntarily. And so everything but self-defense, again, this is according to Locke and Aristotle, everything but defense and remediation of violations against life, liberty, and property are handled by the state, because the state has the delegated monopoly on force. That's what government is. Government is force. And George Washington talked about this. Government is force. That's the whole point of government. In fact, it's the only one that is allowed to use force unless it's not present and someone's attacking you. Then it's like, that's the whole, the castle theory, where if someone attacks your house and there's no policeman around, you have the right, you revert back to the state of nature where Locke says you can defend yourself. So the responsibility to clothe the naked, feed the hungry, educate the ignorant, heal the sick, all of those good things, according to, I would say, Aristotle and Locke, coming up through the Christian tradition, must be done by us, we the people, through voluntary, persuasive, cooperative, competitive means. We have restaurants out there. They're all competing against each other. No one's forcing them to feed us. We go and exchange value in the form of money and credit card, etc., and they give us food. And it's wonderful. We have a wonderful variety of delicious food in grocery stores, etc. That is being done through, and they try to persuade us through their marketing. Come eat here, you deserve a break today, or whatever the slogan is of the restaurant or the grocery store. They're trying to persuade us to come use their product. They're not allowed to force us to use their product or service. That's the Lockean Aristotelian model. Persuasion, competition, consent. It's either that or it's compulsion. It's one or the other. So that's the Lockean inheritance, Aristotelian inheritance, Christian, Judeo-Christian inheritance that we are all a part of. Well, if we were to give political labels to those things, classic constitutional conservatism purports to hold to that idea that government is the purpose of defense. Everything else must be done by we the people. In the late 1800s, early 1900s in the United States, there was a movement called the Progressive Movement that said, that's great. Defense is wonderful. We're glad government's around to do that. But there is so much that needs to be done in society. There are so many poor. There are so many hungry. There are so many naked. There are so many homeless. There are so many sick. There are so many enslaved. We need to do more to help them. We should use the power of government to help them. We should use the power of taxation, which is force, to take from some or many to give to some. And that's what the progressive movement was. And so the basic difference between conservative and progressive in the United States, at least, is not should we clothe the naked, feed the hungry, house the homeless, heal the sick. No, we all agree. We pretty much all agree on that. We want to do that. It's just a matter of who should be doing it. How should it be done? It's not a matter of what to do. It's a matter of how to do it. And you can see it's pretty remarkable that in our nation, we get so riled up and so antagonistic and so angry at each other. And our goal is really the same. We have the same end, just different means. And so one believes that, and I guess in its pure form, the Lockean form, that we do that together through persuasion and consent. And the other says, no, there's some things that are so important, it's okay to force your neighbor. It's okay to force your neighbor to contribute to education, feeding, healthcare. It's okay. Those things are important enough to force. And I am sympathetic to that model because I do believe they're crucially important. I believe we're not living virtuous lives if we're not doing those things. But do we lose virtue as soon as we turn it into a compulsory? And I think Aristotle would say yes. It's like it's almost like the mirror of Erised in the Philosopher's Stone in Harry Potter, where it's like, I see what I want. How do I get it? It's like you can only get the thing if you don't want it for yourself. That notion of it vaporizes the virtuous aspect of the thing that you're trying to do vaporizes as soon as you use force, as soon as you use compulsion. And I think we sense that. If we give something freely to someone versus we feel compelled to give it to them, we feel coerced to give it to them, it's a completely different feeling on both the giver and the receiver. And I think we all have had experiences with that. And so what happens at our society level is actually that same thing that we experience individually between one-on-one, magnified times 300 million, 350 million, which is the population of our country. So that's kind of an arc that takes us from the question of happiness, which is, what do we want to achieve? What do we all want? How do we get there individually? How do we get there collectively? And what are some of the things that might stand in our way? And, this is where, a conversation of, the Federalist Papers would be very appropriate. Aristotle, after he finished ethics, he wrote a book called Politics, which was basically saying, how do we do what I said in ethics? How do we do that in reality? And so he wrote this book called Politics. And it was brilliant, but I think flawed. He said things like, monarchies are obsolete. And that's a direct quote from Aristotle. That was from 2,500 years ago. He said, monarchies are obsolete. He recognized the problem with monarchy. Do we have monarchies today? We do. We didn't listen to Aristotle.
The Europeans ignored him for millennia.
Yeah, and they've got parliamentary systems going in there, but he saw the problems. Like, if you want to have happiness, virtue, and societies built on liberty and cooperation and consent, you can't use a monarchy. It can't be forced. But then he turned around and said, basically, we need to create a system of government that will force everyone to do good and raise their children in this way. Well, fast forward 2,000 years, the founders had 2,000 years of experience. You can go read the Federalist Papers there. So Aristotle did a review in politics. He looked at all the different governmental systems that he had access to, their histories. And he's like, that didn't work. That didn't work. That didn't work. He's like, even a benevolent monarchy, even a good king is a problem, because eventually his children are usually spoiled. They take over. And eventually the children or grandchildren are spoiled and become evil and bad, and they're a tyrant. So there's this, he wrestled with this problem of how do we solve the problem of human governance? And he provided some really interesting ideas about oligarchy and aristocracy and democracy and monarchy and the wrestling of each of those different types of systems. Fast forward so he did his review and said, here's the problems with all of these. And then 2,000 years later, the founders of the United States did the same thing. They said, okay, we have 2,000 more years of experience, and you can go read in Federalist 1 and 2, and they're sitting back and just going, oh my gosh, what do we even do? It's like, we can see where these fledgling republics where they were trying freedom, and they would rise, it would be amazing, and then something would tweak, and they would just collapse under themselves, and some time would come in, and it's like, oh, they were brilliant when they were good, and then they were horrible when they were bad. They would just descend into this horror, and they used to, the adjectives they used to describe. Go read Federalist 1 and 2. It's brilliant. The pictures they paint of the tempestuous wrestlings and battlings. Excuse me. That describe those earliest efforts at a government by the people. And like, how do we solve this? And they talk, Federalist 10 is really great for the idea of power, where he addresses the problem of power again, where he talks about faction, and how a faction is any group of people that have one thing, one common goal, and want to use the power of government to accomplish it. That's what a faction is you can't get rid of faction. There are people who love horses, people who love dogs, people who love the environment, people who love business, people who love, it's like, don't try to undo that. In fact, you will crush freedom. You'll crush liberty if you try to do away with faction. But factions will do away with liberty if they can get into the seat of government, because they'll try to grab the levers of control to do whatever it is they think is the best thing.
This is the logic behind a dispersion of power, dissolving it into a handful of different sections so that no one becomes tyrannical.
Exactly. That's exactly where it comes from. And we even get it from the Bible. The whole Catholic notion of subsidiarity came from Moses trying to rule the children of Israel all by himself, and his father-in-law Jethro saying, Moses, you're crazy. You've got to divide this up. You've got to have captains of 10s, of 50s, of 100s. You've got to have a hierarchy of, if you have a problem, you raise it to this level first. And then if they can't solve it, you raise it to the next level. So only the most difficult problems get to you. That's subsidiarity. So you solve the problem at the lowest level possible. That's, federalism. That's what federalism does. It disperses that power and says, you solve the problem at your family, between your marriage and your family first. If you can't do that, you do your neighborhood, your city, your county, your community, and only the most difficult problems will elevate up. And what we've seen happen in our day is we go straight as high as we can. We don't try to convince our neighbors of how to solve the problem. We try to use the legislative pen and go either to the state level or directly to the federal level and say, please pass a law that makes everyone do this. And so we move over into the compulsion side instead of the cooperation, consent, persuasion side.
In our great knowledge as ignorant individuals, change the country right now.
Yes.
Because I know what's best.
Yes. My family was in Hawaii recently, and one of the tour guides told us about all the different all the different plants and animals that were introduced by different people at different time to the Hawaiian Islands to try to solve one problem. Like, I can't remember what they introduced, like one animal that's like, oh, this animal, if we bring it over, it'll eat this other animal we don't like. But then they found out that the animal, the prey, is only awake at night, and the animal that they brought over is only awake during the day. So not only did it not take care of the original problem, now that the animal that they brought over is now all over the island, not solving. So now they have two problems instead of one. So, and plants, it happened with plants. And anyway, it's just kind of like we humans have a very limited perspective, which is why we're supposed to act at the lowest level possible and not, act at the lowest level possible and use, persuasion, consent. The whole idea of laboratories of democracy, where every state serves as, well, how are the people in that country, in that state, solving the problem of hunger, of homelessness, of healthcare, of et cetera, et cetera? How are the people there doing it? Well, let's try it over here too. If you pass a single law that governs healthcare over the entire country, for example, you lose the laboratories of democracy. There's several problems. You lose the laboratories of democracy, and so instead of having 50 experiments or more happening in each state, like if you want to arrive at truth, which is the whole point of science, for example, the whole point of science is how do we arrive at the truth of the physical world? That's what science is intended to do.
Through a rigorous and consistent methodology.
And if you're conducting 50 experiments in each state, you're much more likely to arrive at truth than if you're conducting one experiment at a large level. So that was the whole idea of the laboratories of democracy, is let everyone try to solve the problems, and then you talk to each other like, hey, this is working better. Great. I'm going to adopt that. So one, centralization of power, which is where we have tended to significantly in the last 100 years, has several problems. One, it has the problem of coercion. So you're losing the opportunity to exercise virtue. I don't feed my neighbor. I don't clothe my neighbor. I don't house my neighbor. I don't take care of the problems in my society because that's someone else's job. We've now delegated not just defense, but the care of everyone else too. So you don't, my job now is to have a career and then go retire and play golf, not to take care of my neighbor, which is what Aristotle and Christ would have said is your job. So virtue, we've robbed ourselves of the opportunity and the culture, the mindset, the zeitgeist, that part of my happiness is to look out for the needs of those around me because we've delegated that. So that's one problem. Go ahead.
I was going to say that we've covered this idea of virtue, and virtue being living in accordance to what we were created to do. We've also talked about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, God-given inalienable rights, imago Dei as well, acting in the image of God. So I'd say, what would you tell somebody who says, I'm an atheist, I believe in this Darwinian viewpoint of life, I have evolved through the very lengthy process of natural selection, I'm essentially an organism, a sack of meat with neurochemicals and electrical signals in my brain that tells me what to do. There is no God giving us inalienable rights. There is no God, or there is no creator who created us in a certain way. So there isn't a way to adhere to, except potentially a Darwinian life to adhere to. So this virtue is built on a foundation of sand. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are built on a pre-scientific, archaic notion of a divinity. What would you say to somebody who said that?
I would say that based on that worldview, you're absolutely right. All those things collapse.
A lot of people hold a secular worldview, though. So by what metric do we hold up these virtues and values and ideals that we have?
Yeah, great question. The whole idea of a secular worldview actually comes from Christianity. If you read Tom Holland's book, Dominion, he talks about the influence of Christianity on Western civilization. And prior to Christianity, there was no separation of church and state. There was no separation of secular and religious. It was Christianity that brought into being, starting with Aristotle, wisdom versus judgment, wisdom being eternal, judgment being temporal, and Christ, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, render unto God that which is God's. So Aristotle and God both talked about this separation. And I'm trying to remember which Christian philosopher it was, but he formalized that into religio and seculum, I think it is, where he says religio deals with the things of eternity that are unchanging, and seculum secular being a century, the life of a human being approximately, deals with that which takes place within one lifespan of a human. That's what secular means. Secular is simply that which occurs within a human lifespan, versus religio, or religion, which is that which that extends beyond the life of one person. So when someone says, I have a secular worldview, it's like, that's a Christian notion. The idea of a secular, it's like, oh, you like to think of just the one lifespan perspective. You're ignoring the religio, which is what persists beyond one lifespan. Is there anything that persists beyond one lifespan? Because if there isn't, if we are meat sacks floating through space, then you have to so if you take the house of cards and you start to push it over and it starts to collapse upwards, like sometimes you see that happen. So virtue is no longer a thing, wisdom and judgment no longer, because there is nothing of eternal, persistent truth. You lose, there is no imago Dei, which means there is no right to life, liberty, and property. There is no need for tolerance. There's no need for speech. There's no need for association. There's no need for press. All of those things vaporize, they evaporate, because they're built on the Judeo-Christian. And that's usually where you find this appearing, is people who inherited that tradition and think, I'd like to keep that. I'd like to keep the tree and get rid of the roots. I don't like the roots, but I really like the tree. I like living in a society. I mean, it was Richard Dawkins recently said, I'm a cultural Christian. He's one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, he's one of the four new atheists. He's like, I'm a Christian. I'm a cultural Christian. I like Christmas carols. What he really likes is he likes living in an open and free society, which is only possible if you have people living a life of virtue because of the voice within, not because someone's going to come and punish them. That's the only way to have a free and open society, by the way, is that everyone is governed by the voice within, not out of they're being threatened by some government force that's going to come in and take them. It's why Adams and other founders said that our form of government is only for a virtuous and religious people. They have to be people who are self-governing, and the external government is minimal. It's only there to talk about life, liberty, and property, and which is not a simple. I mean, you could spend days and days, and the life, liberty, and property are complicated, but adding beyond that is far more complicated. So to the atheist, it's like, what you just got rid of all of that. Now tell me, does that feel right to you? Is there anything inside of you appealing to that voice of reason inside of them? Do you feel, love? Do you feel a sense of justice? Do you feel a sense of right and wrong? Is murder bad? Is rape bad? Is child abuse bad? If so, why? Why are any of those things bad? A lion killing a gazelle is not bad. That's not murder. They're living a different law than we live. We have and if so, then where did that law come from? Why is it wrong for me to go and kill someone, to rape someone, to abuse someone, to lie to someone, to cheat someone? If it really is simply the survival of the fittest, the whole value system of the West evaporates, and we're back to law of the jungle. So my question to them would be, okay, I've just spent the last hour and a half or so explaining where we got our value, the value system that each of us, at least in the Western tradition. I don't know where else in the world this might be played, but the Western tradition that has brought about the most prosperity, the most peace, the reduced poverty the most, has enhanced the lifespan the most, has increased opportunity for the most, has ended slavery to a large degree. There's still other forms of slavery, but we have a lot of problems still to solve, but we are so much better than, just 200 or 300 years ago. It was based on this stack, speaking to the culture stack idea that we talked about, earlier on the phone. It was due to this stack, this moral, political, economic, cultural stack of ideas. Explain to me yours. That would be my response. Explain to me your stack.
I feel as though I'm playing Ivan to your Alyosha here. I think the atheistic response would be, well, first of all, it seems as though this whole it's like a Jenga tower of values and virtues and ideals, and that removing God would be to pull the three pieces at the bottom, collapses the tower. I, as the atheist, would say, but what if we say that bottom layer, that idea of God, is false? What if it is simply untrue? Do we still keep it? Because we know that the virtues and the values and the way our society operates, it works certainly better than, I dare say, anything that has come before it. It works very well. But could we be, as Richard Dawkins is, a cultural Christian, following the moral systems, following well, your idea of the culture stack is that essentially society is fundamentally a moral layer. Then above that, it's a political layer, essentially the legislation of morality. Above that, an economic system, an economic layer. And then above that, the socio-cultural factors that make each society truly unique. So I'd say, couldn't we all be cultural Christians like Richard Dawkins and say, God does not exist, there is no proof, it is not fact, but we can still use the system, keep the culture stack because it works? What do you say to that?
I think we've tried that experiment, and I think we're seeing the results of it. The problem with it is that the very first thing that goes when you pull God out of it is the idea of reason and the divine voice. Aristotle said that to be virtuous, you have to listen to the divine voice within you. The whole stack begins, virtue, character, judgment, wisdom, property, and it builds from there. If you pull the pin out on there's no divine voice, then there's no definition of virtue. There is no reasonable mean. We lose the ability to judge between what is a reasonable action and what is not, which our whole entire court system and legislative system is based on. What would a reasonable person do? What is a reasonable person? It's a person who's listening to the divine voice. Oh, there is no divine voice. It's every man's voice to his own. And Christianity talks about, Aristotle talks about this too, but Christianity talks about this in particular, that there's not just one voice talking to us. We have at least two. We have the little shoulder angel and the shoulder devil. We have more than one voice talking to us, And so if you say, I want to be a cultural Christian, what you're saying is, I want the benefits of Christianity without the obligation of perpetuating it myself, which requires listening to the divine voice and acting accordingly. It's like, I want the benefit of everyone else listening to the voice and acting accordingly while I do my thing. I want that benefit. But it just completely evaporates when everyone adopts that mentality, because the linchpin that holds it all together is every person in that society, or at least a majority of them, are listening to the divine voice. So they know what a virtuous act is. They're building a life of character. They're forming friendships of virtue. And that's what creates the living, breathing, because you have the people who originally created it. They've got to be replaced by new people of virtue. It has to be refreshed every generation. And so if a generation decides, I don't want that, I don't want to listen to that voice, and I don't want to act in accordance with it, that plant will eventually die as the generations before pass away. So I think that's what I would say is, how do you solve the divine voice problem? How do you solve the problem of reason? How do you solve the problem of virtue? It's not self-perpetuating. It's got to move to each generation.
I think that's well, I have a counter argument for the reason part, but I think it does deal a blow to ethics. It's something I don't know how to answer myself. So I'll go the reason tack. What if we have evolved reason for I don't know why, whatever reason that may be, but we certainly have this reason thing. So what if we have simply evolved reason, and perhaps we have evolved certain moral attributes that stuck around because they helped us to survive better. They helped us to fit within larger social structures, as we humans do. Humans are some of the most social species on the planet.
Great question.
How do we know that reason is divine?
Yeah, rather than evolutionary.
Mm-hmm. Biological. A function of the brain.
Yeah. Well, I think one question would be to explore the topic biologically. There seems to be a will. There seems to, the whole idea of reason and virtue implies a will, that this is how you should act, but you don't have to. This is how you should act, but you don't have to. You shouldn't act that way, but you could. So there's a choice that's the nucleus of the virtue, reason, divine voice model. Biology, where does biology display choice? It's through evolution. There's biological mutations. Well, is that what's happening to me on an individual basis every single day if I get angry at a child and I make the decision in that moment not to explode at them? Is that an evolution? It's like, no, there's an element of there's choice happening there. There's choice. So it's not the long-term arc of evolution happening there. There's choice. So how to explain choice with chemical reactions, for example. Another thought would be, what makes two people, if you give a scenario to two different people in two different rooms, and they're like, this is the right thing to do, and they give you the same answer, what's the explanation for that right answer? Well, that could be cultural, but where does that originate from? Where does the idea of the right action originate from? It's like, well, that just came through evolutionary. This is the way to propagate the species. But is that really? So I think you have to explain what is this voice inside of each of us, and you also have to explain the incidence of divine intervention, where there are those who have said, God came and spoke to me and said, go tell everyone else this. Moses, for example, up on Mount Sinai, where he said, I spoke with God and he gave me these laws. And by the way, check your inner voice. Doesn't that harmonize with? So one problem with religion, or one aspect of that longer arc, is you can't learn it all in one lifetime. If we had to start from scratch, like, think of how much we've inherited at birth, how much of society and civilization we've inherited. We've inherited thousands of years of people's choices, actions, time spent. I mean, to fly on an airplane, to use the computers that we're using, to eat the food that we eat. It's all built on literally thousands of years and billions of people, the benefit of all of their experience and choices. And we get that from people who have said, we didn't just intuit this. Like, I don't know that Aristotle received a heavenly visitation. He never claimed to one. But there are those who did. You look in the Bible, and there in the Old Testament, the New Testament, there are those who said, I was visited by the person who, the source of this divine voice that we all have with us. They visited me and told me this. That was written down and now taught to children. And what I'm trying to communicate by that is, we leapfrog significantly. Like, we could try to intuit our way and listen to the voice of divine reason ourselves. We could try to intuit a system of morality, but that would take far longer than one lifetime. We are instead given a system of morality that is thousands of years old, that says, these are the best practices for human existence. Live this way and build upon it and improve, and you'll be happy. We would have to reject that. We'd have to take that stack and throw it out the window. We'd have to reject all that including those who've given a divine witness that said, God came to me, gave me this, and said, go tell this to everyone else. So we would have to come up with a explanation for, not only is this system that we have, this Judeo-Christian theology and Greek teleology based, stack, we have to not only reject the idea of a divine voice within, meaning that it came from externally, that it's an external voice. We have to reject all of the actual manifestations, the testimony of the manifestations to others that said a God, Muhammad, whoever it is, there was an entity that externally came from external and gave us this, and we've actually see the fruits of it. So the cultural Christian is enjoying the benefits, not just of the intuition of the divine voice, but of also heavenly manifestations. It's like, okay, you have to explain that away as well. So it wasn't just this evolved over, unless those people were lying, like that no one really visited. Why would they say that? What would be why not just say, look, we have, through practical experience, we've found this is the best way to live. Please live this way. Instead, We have people who said, this was divinely given. By the way, you can go find out for yourself it was divinely given because that voice will tell you. So don't just trust me. Go listen to the divine voice within you and get a confirmation personally that this is actually what, how you're supposed to live. So we're not closed off. That it always comes back to that divine voice within that Aristotle described as reason, and we describe as conscious. Christians might call it Holy Spirit, Holy Ghost. So that's how I would respond to that.
Well, first of all, you said cultural Christians are trying to take the benefit of the Judeo-Christian tradition without taking on the burdens. If we could do such a thing and take on the benefits without taking on, for example, the beliefs, why not? And secondly, this idea of divine visitation, I'm not sure, but perhaps, what if it could be people, for example, having a sort of eureka moment and misrepresenting it as a divine visitation, perhaps because that's what they've heard. Those are the explanations they've heard from everyone around them, so they assume them to be true. Or perhaps, well, there are also people who have claimed this kind of divine visitation, such as the founder of Scientology. I forget if it's Ron L. Hubbard or L. Ron Hubbard.
Yeah.
Yes. He's claimed also divine visitation, although I'm not exactly familiar with the traditions of Scientology. I don't know if it's extraterrestrial or divine or something along those lines. I would take Hume's heuristic, his heuristic for judging the truth of a miracle. If somebody tells you of a miracle, the only reason to believe their testimony would be if their testimony is more probable. If their testimony of the miracle actually occurring, what was it? I forget exactly what it was, but essentially along the lines of, we know people lie, and we know people are mistaken and biased, and they fall prey to what people tell them. There's a lot we don't know, essentially. And if let's say someone tells us there's a miracle, the only reason to believe them is if the truth of their testimony is more probable than them merely lying or being mistaken.
Yeah.
So I'd say, how do we know it is truly divine?
You just moved right into the arena of epistemology, which is how do we know what's true? Epistemology. And that is the next crucial conversation to have. And I don't know if you want, I know we're now already at the hour and a half we originally talked about, and we could go for another hour and a half on epistemology, and I'd be delighted. If you want, I can give a quick summary of that, or we can have another conversation another time. But you're absolutely right. The question is, how do I know what the truth is? Because I have claims coming at me constantly. And if you go watch the presidential debates that are going on right now, you've got claims coming at you constantly. And so how do you discern between truth and error? And that is the next crucial thing but I didn't learn about epistemology until graduate school. I never heard the word in K-12. I never heard the word in my undergraduate studies. And yet it's foundational. How do you know what's true?
It seems criminal to me. It's practically criminal that they don't teach us at all. I didn't learn this at all when I was in school. I had to figure it out myself.
So that would be, so you decide if you'd like to maybe schedule another time for another episode where we start with epistemology, because there's quite a lot to say there, and I wouldn't want to do it injustice, misrepresent it. But I also want to respect your time because, you wanted to keep the episodes to a certain length and so forth. So you tell me how you'd like to do it.
The reason I wanted to keep episodes to a certain length is simply with the viewer in mind. If I see an interview that's 3 hours, 3.5 hours, I'd say, I don't have time for that.
Yeah.
So I will say, let's bookmark that issue of epistemology for the next one. But I definitely do want to have that conversation. You said we'll start with epistemology. I think we'll end with it too, because that's a discussion.
Yeah, it is. It's great stuff.
Before you go, I have 3 final questions to ask you. Let's say you have someone completely uneducated on all these major subjects. What would you have them learn first?
I think I need to know a little more about what they want. What do they want?
That's a good point. What is the aim of this?
Yeah, what do they want? Because people, there's scary wisdom that comes out of traditions like Christianity. For example, ask and ye shall receive. It seems so simple, so benign, so ask and you shall receive. What it's saying is you will not receive if you don't ask. It will not be opened to you if you don't knock.
Thou shalt not find if thou dost not seek.
Exactly. So the whole idea of casting before swine is giving something to someone who doesn't value or want or appreciate it. And so you have to start with, and this is, again, it goes back to the whole idea of consent, persuasion, discussion. It's like the person, you can't just, yell at someone. You can't just vomit those books on someone. They have to start from a place of curiosity. And so that would be the first thing I have to ascertain is, what are they curious about? Because if they're not curious about this stuff, they're not going to receive it.
So what you're telling me is that there's no easy absolute answer. It's nuanced and it's individual to the person.
Yeah.
It's not the answer I was looking for. Where can people find you, Gary?
Oh, thank you. So I have a very small blog and podcast and YouTube channel called Culture Stack. So you can go to YouTube, search for Culture Stack, Spotify, Culture Stack. CultureStack.online is my blog. I think and listen and read far more than I write and speak. So there's not a whole lot there, but that is where you'll find me. CultureStack.online.
All right. And I'll definitely have that in the show notes or description, depending on where you're watching or listening. And final question. Who do you know that I should have a conversation with? Someone scholarly, scientific, psychologist, philosopher?
There's a lot of people out there. A couple come to mind. I know a gentleman who is he traveled the world as in hospitality. He's an expert in hospitality. He's run hotels throughout the country, Marriott, etc. And then he went and became a professor of hospitality and is now retired. So he's got a breadth of seeing the world and how to serve people and how the world maybe has changed over, a full career. That would be one person. I could reach out to them and see if they'd like to be on a podcast. Another person is a personal friend of mine who had been a policeman. His first career was a policeman. He's in his mid-50s, early 50s now. And he has seen, he was also an investigator for child, sex crimes and stuff. So he's seen the dark side of society. And he's recently gone back to school to get a master's degree in counseling. He's going to be a marriage and family therapist. So he's going to apply. He's going to go from stopping crime to try to prevent it from happening in the first place, trying to heal relationships so that those things never happen. And so he would have some fascinating things to say about, the state, the kind of getting into the seculum side, the judgment side of, we've talked more along like on the wisdom or the religio side here today. Again, but these are two people that might be able to speak more to like what is going on right now, in terms of the application perhaps of religio in seculum, but what's happening with families, what's happening with society, what did you see over your career as a peace officer? What kind of crimes did you see happening back then versus now? Where is society going? Depending on what you're interested in interviewing about, but those are a couple of people that might be interesting.
Thank you very much for coming on the show, Gary. And I look forward to our conversation about epistemology. Thank you.
Likewise. Thank you.
The following is a preview of an episode you might enjoy. You've read at this point a good 1,500 books, haven't you? What would you say you have learned that is not well known, but absolutely should be?
Oh, that's a good question.
Greg Denning has spent the last 30 years researching what makes an exceptional life
and has helped thousands of people around the world create extraordinary lives.
What I'm about to say can alter the course of your life for the better, or for the worse, actually. It's one of the most powerful messages out there, and it needs to be shared with everyone.
Please feel free to tell me in the comments if there's anything I could do better with this podcast. It's the best way for me to improve it. Finally, I'd appreciate it if you subscribed and hit the bell icon, because that gives this podcast more credibility and helps me to have more interesting guests on the show.